afternoon, everyone. We are here today because we want to protect children. In particular, we're here today because we want to protect children from sex abuse in Minnesota. And we want to make sure that those who are, unfortunately, the victims of childhood sex abuse are able to have the tools they need to seek justice, not only from the perpetrators of that abuse, but from the institutions who hide or shield that abuse. So we're here today to talk about and unveil the Minnesota Child Victims Act, which removes barriers and prevent victims from coming forward and seeking justice. This legislation would remove the current statute of limitations that requires victims to file a lawsuit within 6 years of becoming an adult, in other words, age 24. That's current law. If passed into law, the Minnesota Child Victims Act would enable victims to file a lawsuit against their abuser or the institution that facilitated the abuse at any time, no matter how long ago the abuse occurred. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, current law treats child sex abuse differently. And right now, it has or carries with it the same statute of limitations as fraud and product liability. We think that the victims of this kind of abuse deserve better than that. And we know, too, that sometimes it takes a long time for kids to connect the dots. And that's because sex abuse is a crime of secrecy. It's often connected with many layers of shame, and that prevents people from coming forward or having the courage to tell someone about it until much later in life. We all agree, of course, that sexually abusing a child is a horrific crime, and those who abuse children and the institutions that permit it need to be held accountable. That's why we're pleased to have numerous county attorneys and sheriffs from across Minnesota support our legislation, and we're pleased and honored to have the support today of former Minnesota Chief Justice Kathleen Blatz. With that, I'd like to introduce my legislative partner and my state senator, Senator Ron Latz.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon. The Minnesota Child Victims Act is really quite simple and straightforward. It gives an opportunity for victims of child abuse, when they finally gather the knowledge and the fortitude to confront the issue head-on, to hold those institutions accountable that allowed that abuse to happen, as well as the perpetrators that directly caused the harm. Current law is very harsh and has no connection whatsoever to the psychological or psychiatric realities of this kind of a crime. This is very unique. It's unique in how long it takes for individuals sometimes to even recognize that they have been abused. If they've been abused at age 13 or 14, and just the natural human defense of repressing memories causes them not to be able to address it for many years later, there may be a triggering event 10, 20, or even 30 years later, when they finally recognize that's what's been causing them issues, and also gives them the strength then to recognize, to come out of their shell, to overcome that shame, to confront the perpetrator, and to be willing to go public in the form of a lawsuit that would hold the institutions accountable. And that's what this bill is all about. The tort system can do very good things when the rules fit the particular circumstances of the occurrence. In this case, not only a crime, but a very substantial, damaging incident to individuals. And unfortunately, sometimes it's that threat of financial impact that ultimately will hold institutions, especially, the most accountable. So I'm pleased to carry this bill in the Senate. I look forward to getting it passed. Thank you. Representative Erickson.
I'm State Representative Sondra Erickson. I represent rural areas, Mille Lacs County, Sherburne County, and Keenan County. And I'm pleased that the Keenan County attorney has supported this measure. I am here as a mother, grandmother, and former teacher. So seeking justice for those who have abused as children is very important to me. it is, the heart of our society, our children. And when you grow up and you have that latent memory or that vivid memory of having suffered through a sexual assault or sexual abuse as a child, it takes a long time for you to have the courage to reveal that to someone. And as a mom and a grandmother, I know that children are going to keep secrets until they reach their adult years and then seek healing. And, I'm here as much to seek justice as I am to ask that we find a process for healing for those who've endured. And also from the fact that children who endure this often are not achievers in our school system. And as the former chair of education policy in the House and now the GOP lead on policy, I know how important it is for us to know that children sometimes cannot achieve because they have these fears and these experiences that prevent them from learning or from moving ahead. So with that said, I am proud to be a co-sponsor on this legislation called Minnesota Child Victims Act, and will work with Representative Simon to move this forward in the House. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name's Rick Colvin. I'm a survivor of child abuse. I was abused by Bill Jacobs at Breck School when I was a young child. This bill really addresses something very dear to my heart, and that actually is germane to my story. The fact that child abuse as a child, you're so confused. You suppress this. You hold it in. There's all these things go in your head as a child that you're not available, you just can't deal with it. So in my case, and I think like in the case of many, many victims of child abuse, you suppress it. In my case, I suppressed it for my whole life until I was contacted by a friend to look at a newspaper article just a few years ago when Bill Jacobs was arrested for his continuing, decades-long abuse of children. I personally feel that a bill like this will allow institutions that have the power to shut these people down. Bill Jacobs could have been shut down a number of times, but he wasn't. To realize that they have a lifelong liability if they don't deal with this. Right now they can say, oh, 6 years, we're done. It doesn't work for this type of a crime because the wounds are hidden, the wounds don't show up till later, and unfortunately the only way to really get institutions to act the way they should is to hold them financially responsible so that they'll do the right thing. And I think that this is a good piece of legislation, and I'm very pleased and honored to have an opportunity to support it.
My name is Jim Keenan. I too am a survivor of sexual abuse. I was abused as a junior high age child by Father Tom Adamson. I didn't become aware of my abuse until adulthood either. And when you're a grown man who's well educated and you come up with these memories that have happened to you, you get challenged a lot as to, why didn't you remember? People don't understand the process that your mind goes through to protect you. I brought a suit against the church, and it lasted 5 years, ending in front of the Supreme Court, at which point it was thrown out on a statute of limitations situation. It's not an easy task to go through what we go through, and then to find it at the end that time went by, an arbitrary time that somebody else has set up that wasn't a victim. And you're forced to kind of think about, should I apologize for not getting the sense of hurt earlier? Should I apologize for my own self protecting me? I think a bill like this, like Rick said, would hold people to higher standards. there's documents all over the place that show that people think about this. How much longer till the 6 years is up? How much more do we have to dodge it? And I don't think that's right. I think we should have the right to see it through to the end on our own timeline. I found out that my abuser first abused his first victim in 1961. I wasn't born yet. I wouldn't be born for 6 more years. And I would live an additional 13 years before he got to me. And 30 plus, if not more, victims were in his wake. All because nobody said anything. I think I should have the right to say something at any time I want to after I find out I'm a victim. So I'd like to thank the senators and the representatives for the work, and I hope we get all the support we need. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Donna Done. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I want to thank the 2 previous speakers tremendously for putting a face on this issue and having the courage to speak and share their stories today. We are very pleased at MNCASA to join this collective voice in support of the Minnesota Child Victims Act. MNCASA consists of over 70 member programs scattered across the state of Minnesota, all of which provide 24-hour services, crisis services, support counseling, support groups and so forth to victims and survivors of sexual violence, child sexual abuse, and rape. What our advocates see daily are the long-term effects of child sexual abuse and sexual violence. They hear the stories that we have just heard a bit about today. They hear the stories that due to fear and shame, embarrassment, and confusion often stay hidden for 15, 20, 30 years. We welcome the Minnesota Child Victims Act as a mechanism for expanding the access and avenues to justice for survivors who, as children, had absolutely not the power to confront the people who were harming them. Recent research has indicated to us that 1 out of every other Minnesotan knows a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. This is not a rare occurrence. We also know that probably 1 in 10 Minnesotans is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, him or herself. This proposed law, this proposed change, would allow an opportunity for those people who as children had no voice to now use their voice to confront the person who caused harm to them, to bring that person's identity to the public so that we can make sure that no further victims are the result of this person's activity. We see that this Minnesota Child Victim Act is a wonderful asset to a broad fabric of work that we are going forward with in Minnesota. At the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, we also have a legislative agenda that we are including this in the work that we are doing this year. We're also looking at how we can make sure that our counties have sustainable resources and services for victims. We're working to highlight some areas in our Minnesota statutes that are in need of a bit of a change because they are problematic for victims, for prosecutors, and for others. And we have a huge focus on prevention. We think that this is the time to demand a change for children so that no more children have to live the stories that you just heard. It is for this reason and others that we are very pleased to support the Minnesota Child Victims Act. There are nearly a dozen other organizations in Minnesota which have signed on, including the Minnesota Alliance on Crime, as well as the National Child Protection Training Center. If we are truly committed to ending child sexual abuse, we have to work on a lot of levels of a spectrum of possibility. We have a lot of that activity happening in Minnesota now, and bringing the Minnesota Child Victims Act to our awareness and into the work of our legislators is a great boon for all of us. I would like us to all keep in mind the stories and the faces of those children that we've known. Keep them in our memory as we move forward with this work in Minnesota. Thank you so much.
My name is Jeff Dion, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And we are delighted to stand in solidarity with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault and several other victim service organizations in support of the Minnesota Child Victims Act, because victim service agencies coming together shows that this bill is really about justice for victims and protection for kids. In the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting, President Obama said, we're not doing enough to protect our children. And he's absolutely right. Because even though America's heart broke when 12 children were murdered that day, there's at least a dozen children that are sexually abused in Minnesota every single day. And there is nothing that we can do about that until those kids are ready to tell us what happened. And we know that it can take decades before victims are ready to come forward. And even when they come forward after decades, where the abuser is still alive, we often find that they're still molesting kids at 70 and 80 years old in walkers and wheelchairs, because the simple truth is that pedophiles don't retire. They're not going to stop until we stop them. And it's only by allowing these old cases to come forward that we're going to be able to identify and expose perpetrators today, because the kids that they're molesting today, they won't be ready to come forward for another 10 or 20 years. But by allowing the brave survivors, like the ones we've heard from today, to identify their abuser, oftentimes other victims come forward who are more recent and who are within the criminal statute of limitations, and they can be brought to justice.